Hello, everybody. Welcome to Rewrite the Narrative on Climate Change and Fix the Rules. Glad to have you here. My name is Sabrina Bowman. I am the manager of operations and special projects at the Ryerson Leadership Lab, and we're putting this on together with the Rumie initiative. So I'll just tell you that my own background is in climate change. I've worked on climate for probably over a decade, and I have in a lot of different elements of climate change. And right now, I'm very interested in how do we communicate the message of climate in a way that's effective and that drives people to action. Along those lines, Ryerson Leadership Lab has worked on a project called Generation Climate, which is about engaging young people between the ages of 18 and 30 across the country, particularly in rural and suburban issues on climate change. We'll talk a little more about that later. Also, as a part of this effort, we've gotten to work with Rumie Initiative on a series of bites about how to communicate climate change and what climate change misinformation looks like. We'll be putting the link to that into this platform, so you'll be able to see it. You can go visit the bites and you can learn a little more about that. And you can also learn a little more about Generation Climate. The bites are a really easy way to disseminate information. They're quick, they're fun, and we'd love for you to try them out. I will also say a little bit for those who may not be familiar with the Rumie initiative about microlearning. Microlearning is something that Rumie specializes in. It's extremely effective. It reduces sort of the cognitive load of a lot of information. It encourages learners to feel pleasure rather than pain in the process of learning, which is very helpful as we have so much information coming at us all the time. And this leads to greater motivation and retention of information. So now that we've welcomed you, I'd love to welcome our speakers for today. So first, I'm going to welcome in Amber Bennett. Amber is from Climate Narratives Initiative, and she is one of Canada's top climate communication strategists and capacity builders. Welcome, Amber.
Thank you.
Dr. Heather Short. She's been teaching geology, earth system science, and climate science for 25 years, focusing on the present human-caused climate and ecological crises over the past 15 years. Dr. Heather Short, welcome.
Hi.
And finally, I am pleased to introduce Tarek Fancy, who is the founder and CEO of Rumie and the ex-chief investment officer for sustainable investing at BlackRock, a financial services firm that has over $9 trillion in investments. Hi, Tarek. Welcome.
Hi.
All right, so let's get rolling. Lots of great things to discuss, but to start off, Tarek, I'd like you to answer a question. What is Fix the Rules?
It's a good question. The way I'd answer that is I'd say it's sort of a rallying cry or a growing narrative that I think is really important to push as this year goes on and in the next few years as we reach a pivotal point on the climate crisis. And the way I'd explain Fix the Rules is almost by just telling you a quick story about COVID, right? The pandemic hit. I'd moved back to Toronto. And we all kind of in the midst of the uncertainty, right, of there was no vaccine and it was very difficult to understand beyond the fact that we didn't want it spreading. And we had a set of easy sort of things to do, right? You wear a mask, you socially distance. And what I thought was so fascinating about how we as a society responded was that we all knew those were the things that we needed to do. But the government didn't just sort of sit down and say, all right, well, let's just tell people to wear masks and be responsible. And let's hope that flattens the curve, right? Because when you're dealing with a systemic curve that science tells you to flatten, you know that you're not going to be defined by the speed of your leaders. You're going to be defined by the speed of the laggards. And we don't need just a few good people doing the right thing. We need everyone doing the right thing. And so it didn't stop at, wear a mask. There was mask mandates. People had to miss school. Concerts were canceled. All kinds of places were closed. My dog Ruff was very sad because the dog park we went to was closed for some reason, even though it's outdoor. But, we were taking it carefully, and we managed to flatten the curve by doing that long enough to get a vaccine. And what I find so fascinating about climate change is that today it is also a systemic curve that science tells us we need to flatten, right? And it's emissions. And we all, as with COVID, we all contribute. We're all affected by it. And yet, because the incubation period of this threat that science tells us about is much longer, right? COVID, the incubation period, a delay between exposure and feeling sick is pretty quick, right? It's a couple of weeks. Climate change is decades. And because it's so slow moving, it allows us to engage in what I sometimes call convenient fantasies to address inconvenient truths. And one of those is that we don't need systemic rule changes at a collective level, because if a few good people do the right thing, we'll kind of lower our, we'll bike to work and this, that, and the other. We don't need rules that apply to everyone, which of course doesn't work. What you end up having is that in the economic system, I can say very confidently, if there's money to be made, no one leaves money on the table if it's legal and it makes money. I sometimes say that because I worked at a sort of a sharp-elbowed fund that did exactly that kind of thing. And the most important thing I think we can stress is that, our society has rules. And if we really want to flatten the climate curve, we've known for decades what those are. There are price on carbon, there are vehicle emissions limits, there are building energy efficiency standards. And those are the kinds of things that I think one of the key bits around Fix the Rules is meant to stress. It's that, collectively, how we communicate climate change is very important. And how we communicate the solutions to that is very important. And the most important of those are asking governments to use their special democratic powers, just as they did with COVID, to flatten another curve that science tells us we need to flatten very quickly.
Wonderful. Yeah. And, along that sort of path, and I'll just give I have a follow-up question related to this, but I'm going to first just say part of the reason why I wanted to have this conversation today is that we need to think about how we're telling the story of climate change, because in the past, a lot of the ways we've been telling the story about climate change hasn't really worked. People know the climate change is here and it's real. For the most part, the conversation around solutions, the conversation about how we get there, that's where I think there's some trickiness. And so we need to look at what stories do we need to revise? What conversations are helping us get to the heart of this crisis, and how do we use that to inspire the collective action that you're talking about to actually make change, to actually flatten the curve of climate change. And one of the things you said is, what is the purpose of this communication to get to the solutions? So I'm actually going to pass it over to Amber and ask you to start kicking us off on this conversation about what is the purpose or importance of good climate communication? What's the goal?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I couldn't agree more with what Tarek's pointing out. One of the things that we see across the board, and even anyone who is out in the community and having this conversation, often people just don't know what to do, and I think there's kind of two parts to that. And I apologize for my dog in the background. She'll calm down in a second. I think there's kind of two parts to that. One is, we have been told for a long time, small individual actions that we can take. I think most people who are paying attention have a sense that, fixing light bulbs or changing light bulbs is not going to cut it anymore. But how do we, what are the kind of collective solutions that we have? What are the pathways to that? So it's like, what can I do and where does that fit in? And where does that fit in? And so I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted by my dog here. And so I think, when we look at where Canadian opinion is right now, most people can't, actually talk about a policy that would effectively address climate change. So telling stories about role models, telling about things that demonstrably, move the needle, talking about, community level solutions that people can see benefits in their actual lives that would make their families' lives better, would make the quality of life, for the people in their community better. Those are all of those kinds of stories that we need to surface and we need to be talking about. And I just want to say one last thing. Part of that is we're also seeing a real rise in fatalism, or a sense that we're not going to be able to make it. And once we kind of tip over that edge, that kind of kickstarts a whole bunch of other things that we want to avoid if possible. So we want people to feel that they have something that they can do, that it will make a difference, and that they're part of a community of people who are also concerned in making a difference.
Yeah. Dr. Short or Tarek, would you like to comment on this?
Yeah.
The importance of good climate communication? Yeah, go
for it.
I
would. So I think Amber brings up a good point. We really need to talk about community, because no matter what happens, whether we reach these CO2 targets globally or not, by any sort of certain time frame or not, it's building community and local communities that is going to get us through whatever comes next. And I think that is crucial to understand. And it's also how we engage people better in taking action. So I think, to get back to the original question, was like, what's the purpose of talking about climate and climate change? The purpose is to motivate people to take collective action on a large scale. And this is not something that's easy to do, because we're actually in Canada pretty comfortable in our lives, right? Most middle-class Canadians don't really need a whole lot of more things. So the sort of action that's required to address this existential crisis, which is one of several overlapping existential crises that we're facing right now, requires community support and engagement amongst individuals in those communities to support each other through whatever comes next. And whatever comes next is going to be really different and really scary for a lot of people, even if we're managed to move in the right direction.
Yeah, if I could just add, I mean, the task in front of us is, in the next 8 years, we have to have emissions. We have 8 years to cut emissions in half. And the amount of change that is going to be required to do that is really, the scope and the scale of that is something that most people are not aware of and haven't seen. So, I mean, there are some similarities to COVID, but I think that we were kind of dragged along in like small little chunks along the way of like, oh, just 3 more months. I mean, these are significant, deep changes to people's lives and the way that they live. And, for the most part, I would say that the public, what we know of where people are at right now, people, there's a huge public education that needs to happen. And also that kind of activation of people on the pathway to do that.
As an educator, I totally agree with that. I also would like to add that one thing that's not really well understood amongst the general public is the fact that these targets that we're talking about. So I know you mentioned 8 years to cut CO2 emissions in half. That technically only gives us a 66% chance of staying below what's considered safe levels of heating. And even that is the bare minimum. So what we actually need to be doing, what people need to understand, is that these scientific reports are really watered down. They're the bare minimum of what's acceptable in terms of trying to stave off a very, very different climate future. And I think that sort of message, I know people like Amber mentioned, people feeling overwhelmed and just despair. And the antidote to despair is courage. It's talking with people, talking with people who are in your workplace even, and saying, look, this is really scary. We have to do more than what the government is doing, and we're going to get through this together. So I think it's really important to talk about emotions also when we bring up these sort of facts. I know facts and figures aren't really for everybody, but it's really, really important to name what it is that people are feeling and be able to talk about that, so that then we can say, we're going to work through this collectively.
Yeah.
I would add if I have a second, add one thing. So agree with everything said. And the one thing I would add on top of it, I think one thing that I've sort of started to think about a bit more in the last few years is the importance of how we communicate with the broader public in a way that they can understand. Because I think sometimes important social causes become a little bit of an echo chamber, where there's a small percentage of people talking vigorously about it every year, and then more and more and more. But the regular population is watching the latest Will Smith's, slap video or whatever. And I don't say that disparaging.
Or not. Yeah.
Exactly. It's all the debate around that. And, it's not to, I don't say that in a disparaging way to say, oh, look what's happened to people, and people have short attention spans and this, that, and I think of it as, look, that's the challenge we have to deal with in order to get what we need to get done. And it can't be a conversation that's had only amongst environmentalists, right? Because I don't know who considers themselves environmentalists, but I would guess it's less than 10% of the population. And yet 70% of the population wants something done on climate change, right? It's the kind of issue where we're all environmentalists. And when I started, sort of taking a public stance on this recently, I started to realize that a lot of the answers were out there. but they weren't getting listened to, right? I mean, the guy won the Nobel Prize 4 years ago for saying we need a carbon tax. He'd been saying it for decades, right? But he's not that exciting to listen to. And sometimes that gets pushed away, particularly when you have deliberate misinformation campaigns, right? British Petroleum is the one that actually came up with the personal carbon footprint because they wanted us to believe it was all of us doing the right thing and leave them alone from, regulatory changes. And so, I first wrote a paper called The Secret Diary of a Sustainable Investor. I made it as entertaining as I could with anecdotes. And I think that some of what we're all doing now together with Fix the Rules around using microlearning is kind of along those lines, right? It's around saying, look, these are the messages people need, and we need to communicate it in a way that they want to use it. They want to, jump on and they're interested and they're curious, because if it's done that way, if learning can be as exciting and as fun as social media, the potential impact is extraordinary in terms of scaling it and actually sort of driving the type of attitude changes we need.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much already, and I think that one of the interesting things around sort of how we communicate, the research that I know, Amber, you've spearheaded a lot of this, is that we have to start talking about the solutions. And Tarek, you mentioned this as well, that like there's a suite of solutions out there, and a lot of them have been proven, but we're not having those conversations, right, at the level that we need to. And the other thing that is interesting around this, that climate itself, the climate communication techniques itself, is part of the solution to get people on board. So what do we mean when we talk about climate solutions specifically? What are we talking about here? And how does that, and I would add in, how does that connect to this idea of how we talk about climate change ourselves, but also our policymakers, but also our business leaders, but also our NGOs, but also, to our neighbors, right? How do we talk about why is this important to talk about solutions? What do we mean by solutions, and how does that connect to the climate narrative? And I'll invite anyone to jump in here.
Well, sure. I mean, I think I wanted to just say it's 8%. So 8% of Canadians are associated with an environmental organization, just in case you want to know. I mean, I think that there's a couple of things that come to mind when we're talking about solutions, but the basic point is well, there's two. So I have two soapboxes. One is around ditching like obscure elite language, right? Decarbonization, emissions, GHGs, net zero, all of those things. We need to be talking to people about stuff that matters in their entire lives, like whole life solutions, right? So we've tended to kind of silo off like little parts of what we might be thinking about as solutions, as though, people make decisions, in that way, and they don't, so I think there's one part of this is around using language that's just normal and approachable and, and makes sense for people in their everyday lives. I think another part of talking about solutions and what we mean by solutions is talking about, how people live, how they heat their homes, how they, move around cities, how they choose food and buy food, like talk about solutions in ways that make sense in terms of people's overall lives. And then I think the final part is really about being clear about what are the pathways for those solutions. And then finally, I think, it's worth mentioning, and we talk a lot about this right now, is that because people might have a problem with the solution or might disagree with a solution, doesn't mean that they disagree with climate action per se. It's like, there's kind of two things that are important for people. Is it fair? Is this fair to me and my community? Is it fair that, a large solar farm is being put up, in a field that I used to, ride horses in or something? And is it going to be effective? And so people's view or understanding of what's effective is going to be different for different people in terms of how they're looking at it. So I think there's, lots of things to think about when we're talking about solutions, but starting first with the person and what is their life like? And how does this make a difference is kind of the grounding factor, of a good place to start, right? So we're taking a perspective of like the person that you're talking to and putting yourself in their shoes and thinking about, what makes sense and what would be a benefit and what would be relevant for them and what's actually possible for them.
Can I jump in there? Thanks. So watching all the squirrels running around my backyard, actually. So I think Amber has a good point there, but I think we really have to first start with understanding the situation, that this is an emergency, that this is not something that we actually have a whole lot of time to get, people to feel better about what's happening, because it's an emergency. So when there's an emergency, people change their behavior, and without question, really. So we need to look at solutions in terms of what's going to stop this emergency ASAP. And those sorts of solutions are collective action to get governments to make broad systemic changes. And it's almost impossible to talk about climate change solutions without talking about politics, particularly because the Canadian government just approved a new ocean drilling project off the coast of Newfoundland in the same week that the new IPCC report is released. So I think, yes, we need to make the communication clearer, but we also need to, in our education campaign, we need an actual nationwide public education campaign focusing on literacy. So not necessarily making people understand the science behind it or anything, but making sure people understand where we're at, that this is an emergency, make people understand that we know what are appropriate actions in regards to this emergency. And so that people aren't just like stabbing in the dark, like, oh, I'll buy an electric car next year or something like that. Like we need clear targets for everyone to know and understand, and so that they will be able to judge whether these solutions presented to us by politicians or by corporations are actually going to work. We need to be holistic and realistic in what's happening, because this is an emergency.
Yeah, and we have about 3 minutes left. So, Tarek, I'm going to ask you the same question about solutions, but two specific things. One, because I know you've talked a lot about this in the public, when do you think talking about solutions can be harmful if the solutions are misinformation? And two, if you want to share anything about sort of why the Rumie platform and as something that you've created was something you think is really helpful as a part of solutions around communicating climate change.
Definitely. On the first one, I think the danger is always that when you have a crisis that science is telling us, requires us to change our behavior, there's a good reason to, because if we don't, it'll be even worse, right? Whether with COVID or climate change. The truth is, human nature is that we don't really want to change our lifestyle, right? And so if someone gives us a reason to believe what I call convenient fantasy, that maybe isn't even outright greenwashing, but it's what I call green wishing, right? It's sort of the idea that it's excessively hopeful and unlikely to work. The challenge is with a long-term crisis, it's easy to get lulled into complacency because we again don't see the impacts of it. Again, with COVID, you could try the horse tranquilizer and the no mask, and then suddenly you have COVID. It moves pretty fast, and the ICU overflows and all. But with climate change, it's slow moving. The scientists are very certain on what we need to do, but no fault of their own. There's not absolute certainty in every last component because it's just too complex of a system. And so that leaves a lot of room open for, for ideas that sort of say, oh, no, this will work, even if it's very unlikely. And the experts are saying it won't, but it seems like an easy and cheap way to do it. Right. So if I tell you, you can buy a low carbon ETF and make lots of money and fight climate change at the same time, you may not be willing to make a lot of sacrifices and call your member of parliament, your congressperson, or whatever, and say, we need a price on carbon. And so I think the challenge we have is that very often the way the solutions are communicated tend to be the easy ones that don't tend to work, but everyone wants to believe, right? And it's human nature for us to accept that. And I think that's, getting to the second question, that's sort of why the communication aspect is so important, and why it's, I think, really important to talk to people in a language that they understand and they want to speak. Like, to give you a sense for microlearning, launched it in right after the pandemic hit. In the first 8 months, there was 18,000 people using it. There's more than 18,000 joining every week. And it's without any advertising. It's all open and free. And it just seems to be because if you can find a way to communicate with people in a way that they want to learn, right? Young people are mobile users. They want quick snippets of information. then you can sort of A, get better learning retention, but B, very importantly, you just get broader reach. And I think the biggest challenge I think we have to focus on right now is that everybody who is on this call today and who is listening in are probably not the people we need to convince that much, right? It's not to say, maybe there's a little bit of that, but the reality is that we need to get to a point where you have a base where there is real movement for political change, including the sacrifices and tough measures that pay off in the long term, but require short-term pain. And those are going to be the hardest ones to do when we have an economic system that's very short-term oriented, right? Very short-term incentives, and a political system, which, let's face it, is, politicians tend to focus on the next electoral cycle. And we need to de-anchor them and change the narrative so we get to a place where, we're actually willing to do what's in the long-term public interest. Because if we don't, we're disadvantaging younger communities and just kicking the can down the road in a problem that they're going to end up having to eat.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. So we're going to now have a couple of questions from the audience. I'll just say that we had said that we were going to try to wrap up by 1 o'clock, but we may go a little bit over. Speakers, if any of you have to leave, that's fine. But we'll go a little bit over time just to try to get to a few of the questions. So the first one from Cami, I think Cami, does anyone have any tips on how to approach conversation with folks who have very different views on climate as ourselves? Like an actually productive conversation. And I would just add, if you have like a specific example, like I'd be super interested in hearing that, especially for maybe worlds that not just like deniers, but worlds that maybe some of the folks here aren't as familiar with, like the finance world or the business world or students. I know you all have had these experiences. So anyone who wants to go ahead, popcorn style, jump in and share.
Sure. Well, I live in Calgary, Alberta, which is the seat of Canada's oil and gas industry. So I find myself in a lot of rooms. And it's kind of like there's no hiding. First question, what do you do? Well, I work in climate communications. So, I'm kind of out of the closet right away. And I think that really one of my biggest tips is to ask questions, find some sort of common ground, and then go from there. So much of actual conversation is around trust and relationship. And so you need to be able to build trust and relationship really quickly. And the best way to do that is to ask them some opening questions, show that you're listening, and then find some common ground. So if that's around your children, or maybe how, you're both, it might be around health or cycling or whatever that might be, and then bridge into different conversations after that. I think that, people can smell from a mile away when they think that you're trying to convince them of something. So I would say if you really want to have a productive conversation, let that go and start by listening and trying to get a sense of who they are and where they're coming from.
That's exactly, I would second that.
I would third that also. Yeah, I think, and the sensitivity of how you approach it's very important, because, often there's a temptation to tell someone that, or, to be impatient and tell them that they're wrong, or, and the challenge is you don't want people digging their heels in, right? You have to always sort of be respectful to people, and help them sort of along the, the path of understanding where we are and why we need to act.
Yeah. The second you turn it into an argument, it's game over.
And the experience of that conversation will stay with them, right? So it may be that you don't change everybody's mind in the first 10 minutes, but the experience of having been listened to and having somebody respect them will be what stays with them, and will create an openness for the next piece of communication that comes down the pipe.
All right, so we've got another question from Monica. If learning could be as fun as exciting as social media, so I think she was commenting on sort of Tarek, some of your comments. Tarek, sorry. So do we need climate emergency action to deliver hits of dopamine and be addictive? And how do we make that happen?
I mean, I guess it's a good question. I mean, the reality is we need to communicate very, very, very quickly. We need to change a set of narratives that are stale. And including narratives that sort of allow us to sort of say we can have our cake and eat it too, and get to a point where people, realize there are sacrifices required to flatten the curve.
Uh-oh.
Wait, I think we lost you for a second.
Oh,
I
sorry.
jump in and
Go for it.
yeah, I jump in and say community. Like, I think peer-to-peer community and like talking with real people and doing stuff together as real people is also one way to get hits of dopamine and create addiction. Like, people want connection, they want to be a part of something, and they want that to be hopeful and productive. And I think a part of that is community level and like being together with others is a part of what we need to be doing, like actually getting people together and doing stuff at the community level.
Can I jump in here just for a sec? So I see a lot of these, what we've been talking about recently are geared towards young people. So you're right, Tara, young people have, like sound bites and all that stuff. But one of the reasons why I quit my job as a tenured professor teaching climate change is because young people, we don't have the time to let them grow up and then fix everything. So what we need is action right now, and we need to educate older folks like us who actually have the agency and the wealth and the privilege to do something about this climate crisis. So I think what we really need to do is to frame it in a way that's very honest, that's very direct, that's compassionate, and invokes courage in facing these challenges that are coming, because massive changes are coming to all aspects of our lives, whether we want them to or not. And we need to acknowledge that, because I think if we don't acknowledge those fears and anxieties with people, especially with young people, it's as if it's not happening. It's kind of gaslighting young folks by saying like, oh no, don't worry, we're going to make this fun. It's sort of, I think we really need honesty and compassion first and foremost, particularly directed at older folks who have benefited from our present system.
And hopefully my connection stays. The one last thing I'd add, one thing I think why it is important. I mean, you need everybody to understand that's 100% right. But I think why we need young people to start to get more fired up about it is that people often become more motivated if they believe that they're getting ripped off.
Yes.
There's nothing wrong with that. That's the truth. And one of the messages that I really dislike about the climate crisis, and I find actually just ridiculous, is this idea that we're all in it together. We're not all in it together. Right. I mean, I'm publicly in a spat with my old boss, CEO of BlackRock, and I look at him and I think to myself, wait a second, like, he's a 70-year-old CEO who's at the top of the sort of pay scale. And the reality is that the costs of inaction are going to fall to the youngest, the poorest, and the darkest skinned people in the world. Like, that to me pisses me off. Right. And I honestly think that young people should be a lot more pissed off, because we're not all in this together. And I have a lot of sympathy when Greta Thunberg goes out and she gives a speech and she says, look, all we're hearing is blah, blah, blah. Right.
Yeah.
And the reality is that I've seen from the inside why that's the case. Right. Because they're getting answered the need for change at a fundamental economic level across not just Canada, but really globally, with a bunch of words that are intended to preserve the status quo. And in doing so, that actually endangers the political foundations of our entire system. And so all of that is to say that, we really need to communicate across the board. I think the communication, I would actually say it's different for older people than it is for younger people, because older people listen, like, the reality is you control the levers of the system and you're benefiting the most from it. Not everyone individually, but as a group. And I think young people need to start to push more and more on the intergenerational robbery that is, frankly, our answer to the climate crisis and a whole set of long-term challenges, inequality and other ones that aren't getting addressed in a very short-term oriented system.
Exactly. Just to add to that, it's been demonstrated that having a climate conversation between generations is one of the most effective ways to convince older folks to actually act like this is an emergency. So young people learning how to talk, becoming climate literate, and then having these conversations with their parents and aunts and uncles is very, very effective.
Great. Okay, so I think that we might wrap there. But thank you so much, everybody who came out today. I think we could talk about this for a lot longer. And I hope that you have all picked up some useful tools and sort of thought a little bit about this idea of how we talk to the people in our peer circles. I think I would love to be in the room when Tarek takes on the head of BlackRock and has that conversation. So maybe you can use this platform when you're gonna.
I'd love to. Sadly, he's ducking the fight, so that's why we've gone to meme learning is going to be the next avenue, and eventually, hopefully, we'll have some accountability.
I hope so. Well, so this is a good segue to invite everybody who's come today to join the Rumie community on Discord. They'll be putting it in the chat so you can access that. You can meet other Rumie learners, talk about topics that you've read, including our bites on climate misinformation and climate communication. There is going to be an Ask Me Anything with Tarek on April 20th to 22nd on Discord. So you can ask more juicy questions about this fight and anything else you want to know. You can follow Dr. Short on Twitter at Dr. Short 326, as well as her blog, drheathershort.com. And of course, you can go on to Rumie and learn about a million interesting things in a really fun, sassy and saucy way at learn.rumie.org. I had a really good time making our bites with the Rumie team. They were incredible at finding the very technical language that I used in our climate content and turning it into something really fun and useful. So I encourage you to check that out. And please check out Generation Climate, the Ryerson Leadership Lab project to engage young people on climate change at genclimate.ca. Finally, we want to share Ruby can really be used and positioned as a part of the solution and in rewriting this narrative about climate change. So you can check out the bites there under the Fix the Rules section. I think that's going to be in there. Thank you, everyone, for being here so much. It's been wonderful to have this conversation, and I'm sure we'll continue to have conversations about climate change in the future. All right, everyone, have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.